Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Professor James D.J. Brown. He is a professor of political science at the Temple University Japan campus, and his focus lies at Russo-Japanese relations. Welcome, Professor Brown.
Thank you very much. A real pleasure to be joining you.
Thank you that you have found time for this conversation. And as your focus is Russo-Japanese relations, and Japan is a massive supporter of Ukraine in Russo-Ukrainian war. For many in Ukraine and in Europe, it was surprised that Japan has supported Ukraine so massively and so unexpectedly. A good surprise, of course. But how can you explain this involvement, this positive involvement of Japan in support of Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think many people would be surprised by the extent of support. I would put it down to three factors. First of all, there's the moral one. I think when the invasion began in 2022, or the full-scale invasion at least, there was a sense of shock within Japan that a big power like Russia would carry out such an obvious, blatant case of aggression. When war crimes were being reported on Japanese TV, it did lead to a significant upswell of public support for Ukraine. So that's the first point. The second one is to do with Japan's membership of the G7. Japan is very proud of the fact that it's the only Asian member of that club, and it always wants to be in lockstep with the other members, especially with the United States. So as soon as the US started to provide very significant support for Ukraine, there was a sense of obligation that Japan should go some way towards doing the same. And then the last and the most important point is to do with Japan's own security. From Japan's point of view, what was so scary about the invasion of Ukraine was the sense that the same could happen within East Asia. And so Prime Minister Kishida has said on many occasions that a Ukraine crisis today could be East Asia tomorrow. And what he means by that is that if Russia were to succeed, that could really send the message that big powers can get away with bullying and attacking their smaller, weaker neighbors. And the worry for Japan is that that could encourage China to do something similar within East Asia.
That is a great explanation. So the harmony in how the society sees this war and how the political elites see this war. So the mixture of moral feeling for Ukraine and a fear for own security, which also encourage all states to act. But when we talk about this fear that smaller countries can be attacked, we know there is the case of Taiwan, and we will talk maybe later in this interview about Japanese-Chinese relations. But territories of Japan are being occupied by Russia, and we are talking about the islands of Kuril chain, and we're talking about the part of Sakhalin Island, the southern part of Sakhalin Island, which under a treaty, please correct me if I'm wrong, that under a San Francisco Treaty should go back to Japan after the Soviet Union back then and Japan signed a peace treaty, and peace treaty has never been signed. Is this a part of the modern Japanese fears and tensions between Russia and Japan?
Okay, so it's quite a complicated story that goes back a long time. But to simplify things a little bit, although in August 1945, Soviet forces did attack Japanese positions, taking over Japanese-held territory, including in southern Sakhalin and elsewhere. At the present day, what Japan claims, what they're demanding back, are just the four islands which are at the bottom of the Kuril chain, which Japan describes as its northern territory. So in the current era, Japanese government does not claim, is not demanding back southern Sakhalin. There are some political parties that do, but the government does not. So yeah, that is a major thorn in bilateral relations. It's been there since 1945. And as you mentioned, for that reason, no peace treaty has ever been signed between Moscow and Tokyo. That doesn't mean that the two sides are in a state of war. That was ended in a joint declaration in October 1956, but it does mean that they haven't fully normalized their relations.
And that is these three steps of ending the war: ceasefire, end of state of war, and peace treaty are three separate parts. Like we in Germany have signed the capitulation in May 45 to all four allied powers. But the end of state of war for Germany, between Germany and the Soviet Union, was in 1955, if I'm not mistaken. And there was like no peace treaty until the unification of Germany. The de facto peace treaty is 2+4 Treaty of 1990. So it took another 45 years between end of state of war and peace treaty. So these treaties, they can take some time, but still, as you said, no peace treaty between Moscow and Tokyo yet. So what is the meaning of these four islands of Kuril chain for Japan and for Russia? Is it just political symbol? Is it more economic, like territorial waters, exclusive economic zone? Or do they have also military meaning, for example, for the Russian Pacific Fleet?
So it depends on the side. So these islands have different meanings for Russia than from Japan. So let's start with the Japanese side. Here, it's almost exclusively to do with historical memory. For Japan, it's not a question of resources. It's not a question of wanting them for their strategic value. It's rather the very strong belief that this is inherent Japanese territory. The Japanese government goes back to the original agreement that was signed between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire back in 1855. That was not a time of war. It was the time when they were simply establishing their relations and where their border would lie. And at that time, it was agreed that the international border would be to the north of those four disputed islands, placing all of them under Japan's control. And in that period, after 1855, right up until when they were seized in 1945, you had a local community there. You had a community of around 17,500 Japanese living on the islands in 1945 when they were seized by Soviet forces. And some of that community remains alive today, a bit under 5,000, I think. So this is really an emotional thing for people within Japan. You have this old community who were forced from their homes, who had to settle elsewhere in Japan, and what they want is before the end of their lives to be able to return to their homeland. And the sense of homeland within Japan is very, very strong, especially the importance of being able to tend to and visit graves of ancestors. Okay, so that's the Japanese side. On the Russian side, you've got the additional strategic component. For Russia, and in particular for its submarines, the Sea of Okhotsk is extremely important. It has long been considered that Russia has what's known as a bastion strategy. In the case of a major conflict with the United States, Russia would seek to put its nuclear subs within the Sea of Okhotsk. It's very deep. They could also seal off that sea because there are relatively few entry points. And that would mean that the Russian subs could operate there and could launch their nuclear missiles in relative safety. So what that means is that giving up any of the territory that surrounds that sea would be seen as giving an ally of the United States access to this really strategically important area. So basically, from the point of view of the Russian military, it's completely unthinkable that they would give up this territory. It's too strategically important.
For Japan, it's the opposite what Russia claimed to have for Crimea, because like Crimea, the Russians always said it was historically important for them, but in reality, they just wanted to grab this territory to get military control of the Black Sea. So for Russia, it's always about military control. Like the islands are being seen as key infrastructure for military control over the Sea of Okhotsk. The Crimea is seen as a key to military control over the Black Sea, and that is what defines Russian view of politics. They see it as a continuation of the military strength. For them, not war is a continuation of politics by other means, but vice versa. Politics is a continuation of war or prolongation of war. But from the Japanese point of view, Japan is being locked practically in the neighborhood of three authoritarian states or dictatorship states. It's Russia, it's China, and it's North Korea. And none of them is friend of Japan. How does it feel for the Japanese politics to be in such unfortunate position?
I think you framed it exactly the way the Japanese government currently sees it. Um, Japanese officials view Japan's security as being very much in peril. And that's really quite in contrast to a lot of Japan's post-war history. During the Cold War, yes, there were concerns about Soviet encroachment, Soviet subs, in theory, the possibility of a Soviet attack on Hokkaido, but it was very theoretical. In reality, the belief was that the alliance with the United States was sufficient and that Japan was really quite safe under the US umbrella. That is no longer the case. Of course, the US remains an absolutely crucial partner for Japan, but there is the belief that the security situation has deteriorated to such an extent that that's no longer sufficient. And that is for the three reasons that you mentioned there, which is that Japan feels that it's facing not only one authoritarian power, but three, with Russia, North Korea, and China. And the real concern is the three of those powers cooperating with each other. Now, as I mentioned, the alliance with the US is still seen as absolutely vital, but no longer sufficient. So what is Japan doing? They're seeking to add to it by doing more themselves, which means increasing their defense budget and taking on roles that in the past was unthinkable for pacifist Japan. And the additional step is to supplement the alliance with the United States with closer security ties with other countries, which principally means other US allies, Australia, other NATO countries, and also to an extent India too.
If this proximity is that dangerous, uh, it can be natural for Japan to boost their own armed forces, right? And in the Japanese constitution, once again, please correct me if I'm wrong, there are certain limitations to this option. And Japan relied, as you have recently said, all the time on the US support. How much can Japan increase, like boost its armed forces? And can we see now like some changes in Japanese US military cooperation? You said the US can be overstretched, not only Ukraine, but also China, Taiwan tensions. What will it mean for Japan for the next like couple of decades?
Yeah, and in fact, this is something which has been going on for a very long time. So, the Constitution, when it was signed, when it entered into force under the U.S. occupation, it set out that Japan would have very tight restrictions, and this is set out in Article 9 of the Constitution. That's made up of two different sections. The first is renouncing war, and the second says that Japan cannot have air, sea, or ground forces. But what has happened since then, not just recently, but over a very long period of time, is the erosion of that. We've seen gradually Japan taking on a bigger role, setting up the self-defense forces in the 1950s, moving on to take on the role of participating in peacekeeping operations overseas. They even contributed the self-defense forces in a non-combat role to Iraq. And so gradually, they've been doing more. And what we've seen is just lately, there's been an acceleration of that process. And one of the big changes came with Japan's reinterpretation of the Constitution to permit collective self-defense. And what that means, and this is a really big change, is that for the first time, Japan is able to use armed force not only to protect itself if it comes under fire, but also to protect the forces of another country that's in a close relationship with Japan if they come under attack. So that's a huge change. We could have a situation now where, let's say, a US ship or aircraft is fired upon by, say, North Korea or China. And in those circumstances, if Japan's security is also judged to be at threat, then the expectation is that Japan's self-defense forces will be able to fire back, even though they themselves haven't been attacked. And so what that means is, in the possibility of a Taiwan contingency, there's a very high chance that Japanese forces would end up fighting alongside the US if US forces become involved.
That is a dramatically important change, of course. But before we go deeper into analyzing this, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and you will not miss interviews like this with Professor James D.J. Brown, who is a professor of political science at the Temple University, Japan campus. Professor Brown, you have already described this importance of Japanese security and the changes in the region, and we know there is increasingly intense cooperation, military cooperation between China and Russia, North Korea and Russia. North Korea has supplied Russia with artillery shells, with missiles, which Russia used against Ukraine. And recently, we have heard that North Korean military experts can also join Russian armed forces, allegedly helping Russians to operate North Korean missiles, which is, of course, leads to further internalization of the war of the war against Ukraine, which Russia leads. Now, you mentioned that Japan can assist their allies in the region if they are being attacked, what is absolutely new for Japan. How do the neighbors of Japan, democratic neighbors, see that? I can assume that in South Korea, for example, there are different views on this issue. Some can maybe be happy that the democratic force in the region gets stronger, especially while the US is overstretched. But the others can say, "Oh, we're not so happy with military strong Japan. We have seen it already."
Absolutely. And really, what the relationship of greatest importance here is the Japan South Korea relationship. Now, there are other important relationships. There's the Japan Philippines relationship, but let's focus on Seoul and Tokyo. In many ways, these are the most natural partners. A region where there are authoritarian nuclear powers, and here we have the two advanced democracies, US allies. So many outside observers would think, so they must be, natural partners, close cooperation. Regrettably, that has often not been the case. And that is because of this huge divide within South Korean politics, where you have the more conservative forces more in favor of closer relations with Japan because they focus on the principal threat being North Korea and China. But you also have the left wing within South Korea, and for them, their focus is very much on the historical threat from Japan and unresolved, in their view, unresolved historical issues to do with the comfort women, which was South Korean women forced into sexual slavery during the period of Japanese imperialism, and other issues such as forced labor. And so for them, the South Korean left, Japan is still this unreconstructed, threatening presence. So it really depends on the administration within South Korea. A few years ago, under the administration of President Moon, relations really sank to an all-time low, and it was affecting security cooperation, with the South Korean government threatening to withdraw from an agreement about sharing security information. Just at the moment, relations are going from strength to strength under President Yoon, who's a conservative and much more in favor of closer relations with Japan. And so everything at the moment looks good, but in South Korea, you only get one term as president. And there's a real possibility that in the next presidential elections, you will have a swing back to the left of center parties, and that could lead to a deterioration again in relations between South Korea and Japan.
That makes the whole situation, of course, complicated. And what you have mentioned, like all three authoritarian, totalitarian powers in the region, China, North Korea, Russia, have nuclear weapons. Neither South Korea nor Japan have them. The United States, which is an ally and which has like special security agreements with both countries, has them, but it doesn't make the situation that stable. And we know that the military development on the authoritarian side is very rapid. And they clearly have their ambitions to increase their influence in the region. But we have recently seen tensions of non-military character between Japan and its authoritarian neighbors, China and Russia. Both China and Russia addressed WTO, World Trade Organization, with the demands to ban Japanese food export. We have also seen very harsh statements from the Russian Foreign Ministry, threatening Japan with some like harsh countermeasures on economic disputes, etc. Is it something unusual, or is it just continuation of tensions as usual?
I think it is different now because from the Russian side, there's the feeling that they need to retaliate. They need to punish Japan for its unusually strong support for Ukraine. So the Russian side is looking for sensitivities, looking for things where they can hurt Tokyo and to send a message that if you do this, if you impose sanctions on us, if you give this support to Ukraine, well, we're going to do things in return. So that's where this comes in with the cooperation with China and North Korea. That's part of the reason for that. It also is an explanation for other measures, such as the one you mentioned, of banning imports of Japanese seafood. But overall, I think what worries Japan most of all is the cooperation in the military sphere between Moscow and Beijing and Pyongyang. From Japan's point of view, Russia is not really a direct military threat. Russian military forces are in very close proximity. They are based on those disputed islands just a few kilometers away from Japan's Hokkaido. But there's no real expectation that Russia is going to attack. Russia already holds the territory that it wants. Instead, what is the main concern for Tokyo is that cooperation with North Korea and China, and that Russia might serve as an accomplice and, I suppose, force maximizer for those other countries. And so, in particular, with the visit from Kim Jong-un to Vladivostok last year, and now Putin with a reciprocal visit, there's a real worry about what technological support that Russia might provide to North Korea.
So the fear is that after this visit of imperial character of Vladimir Putin to Pyongyang, Russia will provide North Korea with more technologies which would lead North Korea to militarily threaten Japan.
Not so much militarily threaten Japan. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I say that because North Korea already has the missile capabilities to strike Japan. They have fired missiles over the Japanese archipelago. They have, on many occasions, fired missiles into the Sea of Japan and into Japan's exclusive economic zone. So, what would be the real concern is actually the ability to hit the continental United States. So, I suppose, worst case scenario, if Russia helps North Korea with its re-entry technology, so that it can have an ICBM that can be expected to deliver a nuclear weapon against the continental United States. Why that's such a worry for Japan is because then does that undermine the US security commitment to East Asia? The real worry is if the United States thinks, well, North Korea can really hit us, then in those circumstances, maybe they'll feel, well, we don't want to lose one of our cities when protecting, Japan or South Korea. So that's the real worry here. It's more about North Korea's ability to hit the continental United States.
Could be the ways out of this dilemma. I can imagine that some direct military attack of facilities, let me say, these Israel-style attacks on Iranian nuclear reactors or on Syrian technological centers to interdict technological development of certain types of weapons is not thinkable for Japan. Japan will not strike, let me say, North Korean military factories or missile factories. What options remain? Japan cannot completely sanction Russia to make Russia feel so bad that Russia stops supporting North Korea. Military option is not on the table. What options are left?
I would say that the military option is still very, very unlikely. But Japan is preparing for various possible futures. And so another of the big changes that's happened in recent years is the push to acquire long-range strike missiles, so that Japan, in theory, could carry out its own independent strikes on enemy bases. And the scenario which is presented in support of the acquisition of those missiles is that what if you have missiles on the launch pad? There's the belief that these are going to be fired at Japan. In those circumstances, Japan would want to have the ability to strike first in order to eliminate them. So actually, Japan is preparing to have the capabilities to carry out those strikes at some point in the future. But still, I mean, that's not something which really fits with Japan's kind of character as a pacifist state. It's still something which is pretty unlikely. So what about other things holding back Russian cooperation with North Korea? I think the hope in Tokyo is that Russia still won't go that far. The hope is that Russia will repay North Korea for the artillery shells and ballistic missiles with food aid, with fuel, and also with the diplomatic engagement that Pyongyang so craves. But there's still the hope that Russia hasn't fallen so far that it would actually contribute to such a destabilizing scenario by giving North Korea technology that would significantly enhance its nuclear capabilities. There's still the hope that Russia has at least some shred of responsibility.
And this all happens amid economic problems with Japan, which Japan still suffers from. We have seen since over a year attempts of Japan's national bank to stabilize a currency. It's still like not working. Everyone who goes to Tokyo sees it that suddenly all prices in yen are cheaper, but that's because the yen is not so strong anymore. The society is pretty aging. What are the strategies for Japanese economy and for Japanese society to remain strong in the future?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the currency, and that's been the most striking thing. At one point, it was the case that you could go abroad from Japan and other countries would seem quite cheap. Now, when I go to the United States or to the UK, I'm struck by just how extraordinarily expensive it seems because the yen has become so very weak, and that does have an impact on the purchasing power of consumers within Japan. So that has a big impact. The additional factor when it comes to the economy is that it really is also a security problem. So Japan is in the position of having as its number one security threat China, but it's also Japan's number one economic partner. And when the United States talks about decoupling from China, in Japan, officials think, well, I mean, that sounds like such a great idea, but for us, it's just impossible. Our economy is so dependent on China that we cannot decouple. So at best, what they can do is de-risk in certain areas, but there's no alternative for Japan to the Chinese market. So that's one vulnerability. Another one is when it comes to Russia, energy. So, although Japan has introduced so many sanctions against Russia and overall bilateral trade has declined significantly, there is one area of exception. Although Japan, in some areas of energy, in oil. They pretty much eliminated their imports of Russian oil. With coal, it's significantly down, but with liquefied natural gas, Japan has decided that for our economy, it's just too important. So Japan has remained within the Sakhalin-2 project and remains a significant importer of Russian gas. And that's an additional area of security concern for Japan.
And that, of course, reminds us once again how complicated is the situation. Japanese economy is still very strong. Our society is dedicated to democracy, but the number of authoritarian neighbors, the number of economic challenges, and the military threats which Japan is facing recently with all the pressure from these three neighbors, Russia, North Korea, China, are growing significantly. And that makes future more unstable and more unpredictable. Thank you so much for this interview. It was Professor James D.J. Brown, who is a professor of political science at the Temple University Japan campus, and his focus lies at Russo-Japanese relations. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Brown.
A real pleasure. Thank you very much.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you will not miss interviews like this in the future.